Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to the first episode of Global Crisis, Global Solidarity, a new discussion show hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and its Center for International Dialogue, streaming live from Berlin on the first and third Wednesday of every month at 3 in the afternoon Central European Time. The Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung is one of the major political foundations in Germany. We support political education as well as academic scholarship in the spirit of our namesake, the iconic socialist leader Rosa Luxemburg. With our offices in 25 countries around the world, we see ourselves also as a facilitator of exchange and dialogue between the German, European, and international left, and that's the spirit, obviously, of today's show. My name is Lauren Ballhorn. I work here at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung as an editor, and I'll be hosting this week's discussion. In future episodes, I'll be joined by my co-host, Fida Al-Zanin, a socialist feminist and gender studies researcher who will be monitoring the chat on YouTube and Facebook today to take questions and comments from viewers. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can, like I said, drop us a line in the YouTube or Facebook chat, or you can also tweet us using the hashtag Global Solidarity. In the months to come, we'll be inviting various activists, thinkers, and project partners of the foundation from around the world to talk both about the ongoing pandemic and the social, economic, and political impacts it's going to have, but also other problems, crises, and challenges facing our world, and particularly the political left. There's an old German saying, the name is the program, and the same could be said about our show. Global crisis, global solidarity implies that the problems that we face in today's globalized world can only be addressed in a global manner and only by a left that is accordingly internationalist in outlook. It's for that reason that I'm particularly pleased to announce today's guest, the author, economist, and campaigner Ann Pettifor, director of Prime, Policy Research and Macroeconomics, and author of the book The Case for the Green New Deal, which came out last year with Verso Books. Now, the term Green New Deal has been around for over a decade, but it really began to take off in the last 3 or 4 years when a number of rising new left-wing politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, but probably most prominently Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, started making it a central plank of their electoral platforms. I'm only speaking for myself, but I think a lot of people, for example, about this time last year, felt like the Green New Deal was both the most plausible and effective pathway to stopping the climate catastrophe and retooling the way our global economy works, but also a path towards victory for a left-wing political platform and a new direction for our societies as a whole. Fast forward to May 2020, and not only is the coronavirus, or rather the other way around, not only has Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders have both been defeated politically, but also the outbreak of the coronavirus has really pushed climate change to the margins in the headlines and certainly taken it off a lot of the mainstream political agenda. So Ann, as one of the foremost proponents of the Green New Deal in the recent years, how are you feeling politically these days? Do you think we've missed our window of opportunity?
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for having me on here. How do I feel? I feel mad as hell that the left was defeated, that the left allowed itself to be defeated and allowed the right, here, especially in my country, in Britain, to win a massive majority, right? And I think that was a result of, in our case specifically, miscalculations and mistakes made in the campaign. But I think it's also because the left isn't actually utterly focused on seizing political power. And by that I mean that we've got to do more than just speak to the base. We've got to do more than just speaking to those who agree with us. We have to reach out to those against us and win them over and bring them into our camp. And that is hard, difficult work, really. And I think the left has failed to do that. So that's how I feel. I'm really angry about the defeats. I feel we wasted an opportunity which actually has set the left back, in my case, in Britain's case, for a very long time. Having said that, we may be rescued by coronavirus. And I say this because it's going to lead to a transformation, both of public attitudes, in my view, and also of the economy, and in particular of the economy. The economy is not going to look the same at the end of this crisis, or if ever that crisis comes to an end, because the virus threatens to hang around for a long time. But certainly by the autumn, the British economy, and I think this applies to the American and the European economies, are going to look very different. Hundreds, thousands of companies are going to go bankrupt, and the government is not going to be able to bail out every single one. So many of them are very indebted as it is already, don't want to take on more debt, and that applies to big corporations. And so many of them will just not have customers coming through the door. It's going to take a long time before we, the public, are comfortable about flying again. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be people who want to get on a plane tomorrow. I'm sure there are. But it's going to be a very different ballgame to what it was before. And so I think we need to get ourselves together this time and begin to understand the real conditions as they are out there, and make the most of it, and come together in a united way, not to be sectarian. I think one of the left's weaknesses is sectarianism. You want to just be amongst those who are ideologically sound, as the phrase goes. We've got to get off that kind of arrogance, basically. So I'm kind of optimistic, because this little virus, which is invisible to most scientists, never mind to the rest of us, has brought about a transformation. People are thinking differently about the environment. Here in Britain, people are craving for people who are locked up are craving for a tiny bit of nature. We're thinking very differently about the state. The state is transformed by this. We're thinking very differently about the magic money tree. It turns out there is one after all. No more can we be fooled off by the talk of there is no magic money tree. That's gone. The United States, the Fed, has generated more liquidity over this period than it did for the entire greater financial crisis, combined with all the finance that was raised to fight the Second World War. It is enormous, the amount of liquidity, cash, money, whatever you want to call it, the central banks generate to bail out what is effectively Wall Street. Because primarily the central bank, the Federal Reserve's lines are to Wall Street, not to Main Street. Now, of course, there's going to be some help for Main Street, but in comparison to what Wall Street has got, it's minuscule still. So, and the question is that going to be enough? And I don't think it is. You cannot have the situation we have at the moment, where central bankers are running the world. We don't have an international coordinating committee for tackling a pandemic, a global pandemic. We have disbanded, we have tried to destroy, the Americans have tried to destroy the World Health Organization, where we might have coordinated. But we do have an international committee for bailing out the finance sector. And that operates extremely well across central banks around the world, right? And so I think, but the problem is that that's not enough. The economy can't live off central bank liquidity. It can't live off debt. It needs, and the really most important lesson from this crisis, the thing that's been highlighted more than anything else, is that footballers being paid $2 million a week to kick a ball around are absolutely useless to the economy. But people who are stacking shelves, driving trucks, and looking after the elderly in care homes are absolutely vital to survival. And that recognition, it's got to change so much, really. And where is the left? We should be exploiting that, and we should be milking that for all it's worth, because those are big openings for the left, in my view.
Well, specifically, if we can talk about the economy for a bit more. I mean, one of the things that, at least for me, one of the most shocking things that's happened in the last couple months is the literal collapse of oil prices, right? Where we at least had a brief period where oil was worth less than zero. Now, how that looks, what that means is a mystery to me, but at least the markets for a few days or a few weeks were saying oil is worthless. Now, oil's back to around $32 a barrel, and the main market publications are suggesting that a light at the end of the tunnel is coming, that market actors, whatever that title means, have decided that with the United States reopening, business can slowly return to as usual, and the oil industry can heat back up again.
Yeah.
What would a left intervention look like? How could we say, stop, we don't want to go back to this oil economy? Because one thing I would fear is, especially in times of recession, people are going to be scared to take big political leaps. They're going to be happy to see whatever growth is possible and some return to normalcy. What would a left intervention look like? Or what would a left alternative look like?
Well, so first of all, on the price of oil, I mean, I'd like to talk about oil more, actually. But the first thing you need to note is that the price is not the price of the sale of a barrel of oil to a buyer who wants a barrel of oil. The price is set hypothetically by those in the derivatives markets who are trading oil futures, basically. And in a little bit like the stock market is delusional at the moment, the oil futures market is delusional too, right? But it's not just delusional, it is actually determining a price in a very hypothetical way. This is not the real exchange of barrels of oil going on underneath us here. This is the speculation undertaken by speculators, by traders, sitting at their desk in detached markets, if you like, trying to fix the price. So let's deal with the hypothetical price and the real price of oil. And let's talk about the hypothetical future of the economy and the real future. The fact of the matter is that companies are just going to go bust on a scale that we're not prepared for. And consumers are also under the cosh in lots of ways, also because of debt. Because the one thing that has changed is this. We no longer have incomes because we're holed up back home, we're locked down. Our businesses are going bust. We're getting a bit of a bailout from governments. The one thing that hasn't changed at all are rents. We're still paying rents on residences, on where we live. We're paying all kinds of rents to bankers if we owe money, mortgages. We pay rents to Silicon Valley all the time, right? And the fact that those rents are still there and unmoved by this crisis means they are extracting income and wealth from the economy. If you take that and combine it with the collapse of income, you get a pretty dire. So I can take us back to the future and whether or not the oil price, as it's now talked about, is really about what's going to happen in the future. But having taken your point, oil is a problem, right? We don't yet have enough alternative energy systems to provide people with alternatives to oil. That, for me, the left intervention there too is, number one, the first thing we ought to be doing is arguing for an abolition of the derivatives markets. The derivatives markets were set up in 1979. They're a very recent invention, and they were set up by speculators, essentially. We should just ban speculation, right? And we should say we should demand that the derivatives market be closed down. We've had this before. Now, everybody will say it'll be terribly difficult. I don't believe it is difficult. I think it takes political will. But the left hasn't even talked about that, number one. Number two, we should be saying that so long as the state does not invest in alternative energy systems, alternative transport systems, then it will not be possible for ordinary commuters to switch from from fossil fuels to more sustainable forms of travel and forms of energy. And so there will be some kind of revival simply because there isn't an alternative. But this is where the state comes back in again, right? This is the state being reinvented by the far right, by Donald Trump and his crowd, and here by Boris Johnson and the libertarians in the British government. So they're reinventing the state, and they're expanding the reach of the state beyond anything the left dreamed of, really. And so we have to take that opportunity and say, yeah, fine, let's do that. But rather than just pumping money into the private finance system, let's pump money into an alternative energy, transport, and land use system. So those are those are the two big demands that I would make. I would insist that, and that's going to have to happen now. So yesterday, Virgin Atlantic announced 3,000 job losses at Gatwick Airport. 3,000 people losing their jobs is pretty traumatic. But there's an awful lot of work to be done to transform the economy away from its dependence on fossil fuels. The state has to intervene to take those 3,000 people and train them up to do something that's terribly important. It may be, for example, to train them up to be carers, right? We're very desperately short of people to care for people, or to maybe it's to invest in a business that provides PPE, protective clothing for hospitals, because clearly there's a shortage of that. Or maybe we want to set them up to invest in pharmaceuticals, because at the moment all our pharmaceuticals are coming from China. So, there is plenty to be done, and we have to start talking about let's get the state to play this very positive role in relation to the next big crisis, which is really facing us and may hit us in the middle of the pandemic.
Do you see any chance, as long as the state is being controlled by right-wingers like Boris Johnson in Britain, Donald Trump in the UK, but also across large parts of Europe, do you see any chance to win any of these kinds of demands or reforms as long as the right is still in power? Because as we started out, we just came off of two bruising electoral defeats for the left, and the window is now closed for at least a few years.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm immersed in British politics at the moment, but here we have the public supporting this government. And that's in a sense in the way the public always supports a government that goes to war, basically. Believes this government, it's new, they've hardly been in power for 5 minutes. They are struggling, they're messing up according to the public, but we trust them to do their best, and they're all we've got at the moment, right? So at the moment they're popular. But they are in the process, and if I may be very crude about this, of killing all the elderly people that live in private care homes. Not all the elderly people. Many, many thousands of elderly people, vulnerable people in care homes, and the young women and men who are the staff looking after them. That is going to really have repercussions at some point, right? That is profound incompetence on behalf of a government. A government exists to ensure the security of the people. That's why we have government. That's why we have a state. And if you cannot, protect the lives of people, and if you're going to insist on everyone's grandmother is disposable in a sense, that is going to invite a backlash at some point. So I think they can't solve this problem. They actually are going to make it worse. So right now, our government is in the midst of this pandemic, handing out to Deloitte contracts to privatize the National Health Service, right at the moment when everyone is getting out on the street on a Thursday night to celebrate this public service, while we're watching in the United States where the private service is not able to cope. At that moment, this government is doing that. And that will become clear very soon. And again, where will the left be? Where will the left be? Will we be saying, we should right now be arguing that this is totally unacceptable. But it's a bit of a state secret here that the government is privatizing simultaneously as tackling the pandemic. So in a sense, I'm despair of social democracy, frankly. I'm a social democrat myself, but social democracy has lost the plot, really. And I think that takes me back, and I don't want to go on about this too long, but it takes me back to the way in which we on the left view globalization. And let's talk about that again separately.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to get to next. Obviously a major component of your book and of the concept of the Green New Deal is also, at least left-wing versions of it, obviously the European Green Deal is something else entirely. But if we're talking about a democratic socialist Green New Deal, one major component is going to have to be somehow addressing the massive discrepancy between, not only between the global north and the global south, but even within the global north, which I think the pandemic has made particularly clear for at least Europe and the European Union, is the vast differences on either side of the Alps, for example, in terms of healthcare systems, economic capacity, et cetera. Going out of this pandemic, I mean, you were talking yourself about the thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of bankruptcies we're going to be looking at, and the massive new public debts that are going to be that the global north is going to have to take on in order to bail out its corporations and its private sector. So when we link that back to the Green New Deal, where are we going to find the money or the resources, however you want to phrase it, to finance the kind of investment we would need in the global south in order to begin to close that gap? Where would those funds come from, and how could it even be done in a way that does not further heat up the climate?
Right. So on the public debt in the north, there's only one way. Well, there's two ways you can approach it. Actually, no, there is only one way to bring down the debt. Only one way, and that is to create employment, and employment will generate income, and income not just for the individuals employed, but tax revenues for the government. That is the only way to balance the budget, basically. No other way will work. So the right believes that if you cut government spending, you can balance the budget. But the 10 years post-crisis has taught us that no, it didn't. It didn't bring down the debt at all. In fact, the debt rose while they were cutting debt. So the logic of cutting in order to balance the books has been exposed for the flawed theory that it is. And Reinhardt and Rogoff have got a lot to answer for, basically. So there is that. The best way to restore stability and prosperity to the northern economies is through the creation of jobs, particularly green jobs, across the board, and to generate income that way, right? And that's how we help restore the private debts as well. That's one thing. On the south, and I have to say, I was born in South Africa and I grew up in South Africa, and my heart is in Africa, really, most of the time. The way the South has been treated during this crisis shows us what could happen in a climate crisis. And it is this. The minute the pandemic took hold, investors, creditors, and speculators gathered up their money and rushed out of low-income countries, emerging markets, low-income countries, and they all rushed towards the globalized, the global dollar, the dollar. And what has happened is that the dollar strengthened while their currencies collapsed, and that increased the cost of imports for them, but it also lowered the income they generated by exporting. Commodity prices fell simultaneously, at which point the West sent in its rating agencies to downgrade countries like South Africa, which immediately increased their borrowing and their debt costs immediately. The combination of that kind of hit, which comes from nowhere, has nothing whatsoever to do with, for example, the South African economy, and then having to face a plague, the pandemic, was just outrageous, really. But the point is this: the globalized system is designed for that to happen. That is its purpose, and the left doesn't understand that. The left goes on about how wonderful globalization is because we can all talk to each other and we can fly across Europe and we can cash checks, or we can raise money, we can use our debit cards wherever we want to use our debit card and our credit cards, and we can buy from Amazon, and isn't it wonderful? And we can pay Netflix and get movies every night, and isn't that all wonderful? That's what the left thinks, right? And that's exactly what the right would like us to think. So we haven't got a critique of globalization, and our big worry is, of course, that if we talked about managing globalization, we might have to talk about managing flows of people across borders as well as capital and trade. And we don't want to talk about that. And that puts us in the position of supporting globalization, really. So here we are, we find ourselves, in Britain, the Brexit campaign was an anti-globalization campaign. People felt that the system had gone beyond their reach, that they couldn't hold accountable whatever it was that was stripping them of jobs, that was stripping their industries of the whole sectors. They couldn't understand where all that was coming from. They blamed Europe. And in a sense, that was part of blaming a globalized system. In my view, Trump campaigned on an anti-globalization ticket. I'm going to protect you from those Mexicans, from the Chinese. I'm going to put up walls. I'm going to look after them. America first, right? I mean, he himself, of course, is a globalist, because he wouldn't manage if he didn't have hotels and golf courses all over the world. So he's a fake globalist, anti-globalist. But nevertheless, he won an election on an anti-globalist ticket, right? And I think we in Britain and in Europe have not understood what's happening to our. I mean, I go back to Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi was very, very clear that the rise of authoritarianism and fascism in Europe was a direct result of having government by markets. Markets deciding on our exchange rate, our interest rate, and on capital mobility across borders. Markets deciding whether or not I get healthcare. Markets deciding, whether or not I can afford to go to university. Markets deciding whether or not I can have a roof over my head, right? And when markets are left to, and then the politician says, well, I'm terribly sorry, I can't help you, because the market says, that you've got to pay this much for a house, and if you can't afford it, tough. And I'm not going to build social housing for you. I'm sorry, I can't help you. If you can't get into university and pay the fees, that's tough. And if you can't pay your debts, well, you may go bust, right? That's what the market says, and that's what politicians have agreed to. And so I think we've landed ourselves in this trap where we do not understand how the international system works, how it's geared towards the interests of creditors, speculators, and bankers. And we go along with it. We've got to understand you can't have a world of totally untrammeled, free movement of goods, money, and I have to say people. Right here in Britain today, and I'm an immigrant, so look, believe me, I believe in refugees and migrants being given somewhere to live. But today, our government is refusing to test people coming through the airports, right? They're refusing to do anything to stop the flow of people across borders. That's totally logical for them. They're libertarians, right? We've just heard on the radio about one of the islands off Britain that's become sort of autonomous, Guernsey, and they went along with this strategy, and suddenly people started dying of the virus. So they've put up the barriers. They've said, you can't come in. You can't come in until we've sorted this, until we've got a vaccine, until we're better, and that's tough. It's tough for the people at home as well as for the people wanting to travel to Guernsey. But they are saving the lives of their people. The British government doesn't care, I'm very struck because my son-in-law lives in Vietnam, and daughter-in-law. And Vietnam has been extraordinarily successful in managing this virus, even though she has a border of 1,500 miles with China. And she's done that through managing the flow of people coming across borders, checking and testing and so on and so forth. Libertarians won't have that. So for me, the left.
Thanks a lot, Ann. As long as we still have you on the line, I'd like to hand it over to Fida to get a couple of questions from the stream.
So I have this question from YouTube. We are often told that growth and progress go together. Can we reconcile the notation of progress with the acknowledgement that infinite growth is impossible?
The question was, we often are given the impression that growth and progress are the same thing. And is it possible to reconcile the need for growth with the finite resources of our planet?
No, not at all. Growth is a sort of mathematical concept. And in that sense, it's possible to be exponential, whereas the Earth is finite in its resources, and the two are totally incompatible. But I just want to say this. The concept of growth in economics is a relatively recent one. It's a neoliberal one invented by the OECD in the 1960s. And it was about watching the private finance sector take off exponentially. Because if you gamble, you make what are called capital gains, but you make them at an exponential rate. If you're a brave entrepreneur and you're going to invest in a project, well, it takes time because you have to engage with the land and you have to engage with labor, and you have to take risks, and it takes time before your project comes to fruition. If you're a derivatives trader on the oil market, you can just sit at a computer and make $1 million in 5 seconds. So when capital gains started to be made from just financialization, the OECD argued that the real economy had to grow in exactly the same way. And it set the most unsustainable target in that year for the next 10 years for the British economy, which caused inflation. So I don't want us to even use the word growth because it is a neoliberal term and a neoliberal concept. And even the term degrowth kind of reinforces the concept that there is a growth. I think we need to talk about sustainable activity, and it has to be in line with the Earth's resources, in line with the finite resources we have to our. And for me, that is about labor, because one of my problems is, and I've had rows with Green campaigners and Green MEPs who would like to see very high levels of unemployment because they think that's very anti-growth and a very good thing. And I say, no, in a world of sustainability, we're going to have to substitute labor for carbon. We're going to have to ride our own bicycles. We're going to have to grow our own green beans, as always, instead of having them flown over from Kenya. And that means, that there'll be far more labor-intensive activity. And and that needn't be necessarily greenhouse gas emitting. And in particular, we need a lot of labor in the service sectors. So I don't want us to talk about growth in that sense because that's to reinforce a concept. I think we've got to talk about living within our means and acting and conducting an economic policy which recognize that which is finite, which is the earth.
Fida, do we have another question from the stream?
Yes, but I want to make sure if Anne can hear me right now. Is it clear? No.
It's a little bit. It's a bit quiet.
It's very.
I can't hear.
Okay.
So, I'll try to speak louder.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there's this question. A major theme in your book is the dominance of the U.S. dollar as the international reserve currency and the need to abolish it to democratize the global economy. The U.S. has had a disastrous response to the coronavirus and seems to be on the verge of an unprecedented economic depression. Could this mean the end of the American economic hegemony?
So if the current crisis may be the prelude, so to speak, to the end of American hegemony.
The end of American hegemony. Well, if only. I mean, I have had a bee in my bonnet about the US dollar for a very long time. And this crisis has convinced me that this is a system change, a systemic change that is absolutely vital. But I need to say this to you. So yes, I think we have to. This is now one of the things that's very striking is that the dollar is completely linked to oil. I don't know if you know the story, but in 1973, Nixon sent a delegation to see the Saudis, and this was after the Saudis had quadrupled the price of oil. In light of the Israeli war, the Yom Kippur War, where in revenge, the Arab states and the Saudis in particular raised the price of oil. But they also had risen the price because after Nixon unilaterally bailed out of the Bretton Woods system, the value of the dollar fell. And because revenues were being earned in dollars, revenues fell for those oil producers. So in response to that, the oil producers quadrupled the price, the war and also the collapse of the dollar. And so Nixon sent a delegation over to do a deal with the King of Saudi Arabia, and that was this, that in future, all oil purchases would just be made in dollars. Nobody can buy oil in any other currency, right? And that meant that, number one, and that in exchange, the United States would give Saudi Arabia military protection. That meant that every dollar of oil ever sold anywhere goes straight into the coffers of the United States Federal Reserve or the Treasury and helps to pay for the US deficit, right? And when you think of a poor country, the poor countries in Africa that have to have oil, they've got to buy it in dollars, and they can only sell, for example, their sugar or their cocoa or their beans, their soya beans. They're selling them at a low price, and sometimes in dollars, but many times in not. So the dominance of the dollar and the link to oil has been profound. Now, very interestingly, there was a story in the papers the other day, which may just be gossip, about Trump at the beginning of this crisis saying to the Saudi prince, if you don't cut production of oil to protect the American fracking industry, because the oil price has fallen too low to make it profitable for the American frack. If you don't do that, I am withdrawing all of the military from Saudi Arabia. And he said there'd be a resolution in Congress and he would have to back it. And immediately the prince collapsed and said, yes, we'll cut back on the production. So that tie is still so closely there. And we have to think about it. And we have to think about how damaging it is. But again, the left doesn't think about the international system. We're not as affected as South Africa is by this dollar, so we don't care so much. But can I bring us back to Europe as well, and in particular to the decision made by the European Constitutional Court, by the German Constitutional Court yesterday, which is that Germany wants to become the hegemon of Europe in the way that the United States is the hegemon of the world. And the decision yesterday was an outrageous decision, and it will contribute to the further disintegration of the European project. And instead, you'll just have the hegemon stand alone. So, why the dollar is a problem? The euro and the construction of the euro and the way in which it operates and the power that the German courts have over it is another very big problem that we should be thinking about.
Thanks so much, Ann. We're almost out of time, so I'd like to close with one last question from me. Your book talks about 10 to 12 years to get where we need to be to stop at least the worst of the climate catastrophe. We missed two important possibilities or two important shots with the general election in the UK and now the Democratic primary. What would you say is the next most important test for left-wing forces trying to get towards some kind of transition to a solid state economy?
Wow, that's a hard one. I would say the next test is whether or not the movement can generate leaders. And I know that's not fashionable because we like to think we're egalitarian and democratic and we like to talk about delegation to the grassroots and all that. But we need strong political leadership. And I just don't think we have that. Now, leadership, in my view, comes out of a vibrant movement and emerges from a strong movement. Mandela came out of a very strong movement. And the fact that we don't have leaders at the moment is an indictment of the movement. It isn't strong enough, it isn't big enough, it isn't noisy enough to actually generate the kind of leaders we need. And leadership is a hard thing. It is a really hard thing. It means, I think in the case of Britain, it meant doing something against the wishes often of the people that you think are going to vote for you, really, is going in a different direction. I always look to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was a wily old leader. And he was often wrong. He was both racist and sexist, let's face it. But he won political power, and he held political power on behalf of the working class of America for a very long time. And was very popular with it. He took difficult decisions. He took on the courts. He took on, sometimes he gave in to the right, very often he gave in to the right, but he did so very carefully in order to make gains elsewhere. So kind of those kinds of judgments harden. I'm not sure if the left is willing to support and help generate a leader, because I think we kind of don't know where we are at the moment. So that's a pretty dismal analysis, but I think it is something, for me, what we have to do is become very much more political, and we have to seize and want to seize political power. I suppose the thing I'd say most is we have to want political power. And I think a lot of us would rather not deal in political power. It's a messy business. It's dirty. It can be pretty ugly, really. And it forces one to make very difficult decisions. So we don't want to go there. We'd rather sit out in the woods, kind of, with our slogans and with our good thoughts and feel very virtuous and hang around with friends. And that ain't the way to transform the world, is my view.
Thanks a lot, Ann. I think that's a great point to leave it at. I want to thank our guest, Ann Pettifor, for joining us today, and everybody who was watching and submitted questions online. If you didn't manage to see the whole show, if you tuned in late, the whole episode will be on our YouTube page. That's youtube.com/Rosa-Lux-Stiftung. And if you'd like to join into our next conversation, follow us on Twitter, Rosa-Lux_global. Feel free to tweet us or send us DMs with suggestions for future episodes. If you want to continue the conversation about the Green New Deal, our Brussels and New York offices are offering a webinar tonight at 7 p.m. Central European Time, that's 1 p.m. New York time, called With Everything Up for Grabs, the Green New Deals the World Needs Now. You can register at www.rosalux.eu, and we'll be joined tonight by Mike Davis, Maud Barlow, and Martin Sherdewan from the European Parliament. Join us again in 2 weeks on Wednesday, May 20th, again at 3 p.m. Central European Time. Our guest will be Sabrina Fernandes, a Brazilian sociologist and editor of Jacobin Brazil, as well as a postdoc fellow here at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. We'll be talking about what else? Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and the incredible political and social crisis facing that country. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.